So today's talk is about Bergson and Sri Aurobindo, and it forms part of a consideration that I've been undertaking lately related to a book that I'm co-writing with Dr. Robert McDermott, who's here today. Thank you, Robert, for attending. I will be sharing my notes on the way, one may say, on this journey to understand Bergson and Sri Aurobindo. And hopefully there'll be an occasion for us to discuss some of these ideas through questions and comments at the end. So in that spirit, I would like to share my ideas. Bergson and Sri Aurobindo are both vast thinkers, but I will take a certain perspective as a starting point, and particularly as a way by which we can address the two of them together in a resonant way. And so that perspective is their ideas on intuition. So this is really the key in which I'm going to consider this this talk. So Henri Bergson, years are 1859 to 1941. So he's a senior contemporary of Sri Aurobindo, older than him by how much? About 15 years or so, almost. Bergson actually was not a French person to start with. He came to France. His mother was English. His father was Polish. And he spoke fluent English and had actually a opportunity to be an English citizen, but he chose to be a French citizen. And he studied at the École Normale Supérieure, where I was fortunate to visit not very long back with my colleague, Jack Bagby, who is also here, a Bergson scholar, and teach at the Collège de France. Bergson wrote a number of books, and the important books I would just like to mention that I'm drawing from are his early book, which actually was one of his doctoral thesis, was Time and Free Will, written in 1859, and then Matter and Memory in 1896. He wrote a paper, a very important paper, which was later published as part of a volume called Creative Mind. The paper was an introduction to metaphysics, written in 1903. Creative Evolution, that really catapulted him into fame, was written in 1907. And Two Sources of Morality and Religion was written in 1932. And then, as I said, Creative Mind was compiled, essays with this introduction to philosophy as a centerpiece, in 1934. Two other really important events that punctuate the life of Bergson is that in 1922, he had a famous or infamous debate with Einstein, a short-lived, easily dismissed. I think he was dismissed by Einstein, but a debate that has its repercussions to this day. And in 1928, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So even by 1922, when he had his debate with Einstein, he was a celebrated philosopher in France and through the continent and even in America. But he has later fallen sort of into I mean, not he's not considered, or he was not considered that important. After a little bit, he fell out of favor, generally fell out of favor. And maybe the debate with Einstein had something to do with it, but also the perception developed or grew that he was kind of a woo-woo philosopher, as we would call him today, a mystic of sorts. There are two other probable factors to that. He was closely connected with the Society for Psychical Research, was actually its president for some time. And his relationship with phenomenology was not that great. This is another very interesting thing, because in a way, we could consider him one of the founding figures of phenomenology. But the founder of phenomenology, Husserl, who was born in the very same year, absolute contemporary of Bergson, didn't have that good, intellectual relationship with him. And it's only later that people like Merleau-Ponty have acknowledged his importance as a phenomenological source. The ideas of Bergson that are really prominent, many people have heard of just as ideas, terms that he has introduced into the philosophical lexicon are the ideas of duration, of intuition, philosophical intuition particularly, and of the Elan vital, which may be one of the reasons why he lost favor, because the whole notion of some kind of a consciousness will or consciousness force was not looked at so kindly by the philosophical community. He also introduced the idea of the memory cone, as we will consider, and the notion of planes of consciousness, a term he literally uses, planes of consciousness, as we will see. Number of these terms were actually also used by Sri Aurobindo, as we will also see. Now, Sri Aurobindo read Bergson, and the question is, we're not absolutely sure when he read Bergson. We'll have a chance to consider it. Some think he read Bergson in the 30s, well after he had written his major works. But in his major works, we already find references to terms that turn up in Bergsonian literature. We'll also see a very important metaphor that he uses that is very likely to have been, most likely to have been taken from Bergson. Today, Bergson is seeing a revival, and for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, is that he has been given tremendous credit by Gilles Deleuze, who's a very popular philosophical influence of our times. But along with it, his ideas of immanence, his ideas of multiplicity, his ideas of some kind of a intuition that connects us to the real are seen as more and more important. So this is the kind of background. Some people have tried to compare Sri Aurobindo with Bergson in the past, particularly due to his use of Bergson's use of the term creative evolution, the notion of consciousness, the notion of a becoming that is progressing, that may be moving beyond the human. For these reasons of consonance, there have been people, particularly one philosopher, S.K. Moitra, who was a professor at the Banaras Hindu University and wrote an important book called The Meeting of East and West in Sri Aurobindo's Thought, has written about Bergson. Sri Aurobindo, on a variety of occasions, has made comments on Bergson as well. I find these writings by others, particularly S.K. Moitra, to be not very satisfactory, because they do not really address Bergson in a kind of a holistic manner. You don't get a sense of Bergson as a thinker over all his works. And for that, I would like to suggest Bergson himself as somebody who points out the way of how to read philosophers. And this he does in his book, Introduction to Metaphysics, in a chapter, or rather particularly in Creative Mind, in a chapter called Philosophical Intuition. And I think I'd like to start with that and get back to that later, because that is how I would hope to read Bergson and hope to read other philosophers as well. And it is a launching pad to our understanding of intuition in the case of Bergson. So he's looking at thinkers like Berkeley, and there's a number of other thinkers there as well that he's looking at. He's looking at Spinoza and Berkeley in that part of the book, and he's saying that the way to read these people is to look at a lot of their works. So he's saying that it is only when one has extensive familiarity with the surface realities of things that one is ready for intuition. And what he's saying over there is that as one reads, there is a second kind of knowledge that develops. So he is pointing to, and in other works as well, pointing to two sources of knowledge. One source of knowledge is our superficial and intellectual understanding of things that is occurring out of different things that we read, that have occurred at different periods of time. And the other is what he calls an idea image. So there is a kind of an image that is forming. By image, he doesn't necessarily mean something to do with the eyes, but a conceptual image that is forming. And that is really, he's pointing to the fact that that is the intuitive understanding that is developing, which really puts us into contact with something that has been guiding this philosopher itself, something that we may find in all the philosophers' works. And the philosophers' works are an evolution in that sense, a kind of working out of that idea. So how to contact that idea, and whether when we read people or philosophers, we can keep in mind this fact of looking for these two sources of knowledge, something that by familiarity opens us to another contact, another kind of contact with that which does not change in all that writing and is really a kind of elaboration according to circumstances that one encounters of the implications of the idea. So this is just a notion that's at the center of philosophical intuition in Bergson. Now, coming now to Bergson's philosophy and his philosophy of intuition. Bergson's philosophy really makes a kind of, I mean, we have to look at this in terms of his time and in terms of the contribution it makes to philosophy as a whole in modern times. So he is ready to point out again and again that our normal apprehension of reality that we share, and maybe not just we, but all living things share, is through the present. We find ourselves in the present. And this present is experienced by us, to use his terms, as a homogeneous space characterized by differences of degree. Now, what that means, a difference of degree, is that it means that we are looking at different things that we can, in a sense, compare to each other according to different scales of more and less. Things are bigger or smaller, or things, even if we think of qualitative properties, things are prettier or uglier, things are, in the sense of, let's say, if we talk about color, we can put a scale of some sort and say they are of different frequencies on a electromagnetic spectrum, etc. In other words, they are measurable and differentiable in terms of degrees of various scales. So they occupy a homogeneous space of that unit in which they can be compared to each other in degrees. So this is how we apprehend reality, as if it is a discrete reality in space as well as time. We talk about instants and we compare them to each other to arrive at generalities. Now, this kind of perception has been with us. It's normal to us because it allows us to handle the world that we experience. And if we look at the way we have thought about this, in other words, the whole enterprise of thinking, which is philosophy, in our times, that makes its beginning as Enlightenment philosophy, then we see that Enlightenment philosophy proceeds by abstractions and generalities, which are applicable to reality. So in other words, a kind of thinking about ideas and concepts by which we can explain things and then apply them to these types of differentiations in space and time. Instances instantiated across these points in space and time. Of all these Enlightenment philosophy, really, one may say, begins to take off from around the 17th century. But along with it, you find the increasing prominence of one field of philosophy, which is natural philosophy, which becomes what we today call science. And Newtonian science, for example, from the 17th century, is something which increasingly gains importance. And what it is looking at reality in these very terms of discreteness, of instance, of being able to compare across scales, and being able to make generalizations that are valid for all space and time. Now, already in that, we may see that there is a certain kind of a problem in that, and Bergson points that out, in that time is irreversible. We can talk about all time, and in all times, things exist in a certain abstract way, but in fact, they don't. There is a way by which time is irreversible and experienced as not changing. So this, of course, grows in importance. Now we have other ways of looking at space. Classical physics has been overtaken by modern physics. We have relativity and quantum physics, which have turned the whole notion of what is space and time into a more paradoxical space. And that paradoxical space gives us pause to wonder whether we can think at all about scales of entities that exist. Entities don't necessarily exist until we measure them. So there has been a kind of complication of the situation that has taken place. And natural philosophy or science, as Bergson was encountering it at that time, and he was part of the very, process, and he was living through the process when these changes were taking place. Now, one of the things that people have often said about Bergson relative to this, because he was pointing this out in a critical way, is that he's anti-science. But as a matter of fact, he was pointing to science as a domain of understanding, and that if we read his works, we'll see that it is constantly a conversation with science. He's taking all his metaphors out of science. He is trying to take the instances of science and extrapolate them into other understandings. And how does he do that? He does that by applying intuition. And that's what we're going to look at. And so, just as I said right at the beginning, to even arrive at implication, we need to have a really thorough relationship with surfaces. He would say that science actually, and the advances of science, in fact, help us because they fill out those abilities, the human ability to contact reality at the surface, so that we may have a deeper understanding of what it is that is manifesting in the surface. Now, this is happening, of course, all this is to talk about science, and science introduces as a result a kind of crisis as far as philosophy is concerned. Natural science philosophy becomes the domain of philosophy, and in the very word science means knowledge. In other words, it's a usurpation of the very field of knowledge. All knowledge is like omniscient science. But at the same time, there is a kind of, so there's a crisis in the sense that what is the place of any other philosophy if all our knowledge is going to come from this method that we call scientific? There is another factor that comes at the turn of the 17th and 18th century, the 18th and 19th century, which introduces, again, a big crisis into science. Into philosophy and Enlightenment philosophy. And that is the advent of Kant. And so Kant, the simple way of talking about Kant is that Kant introduces the idea that all our knowing is not going to give us any true sense of the thing in itself. See, all our knowing is conditioned and determined by our apparatus of knowledge. See, we have an apparatus of knowledge. Human beings know in a human way, and what we know is what we synthesize of the reality that we experience through our senses, using sensory synthesis and intellectual synthesis to come to a picture that we store, and that in a sense becomes the reality that we live. Now, that introduces another big crisis, you see. So these are the two factors of the crisis of modern philosophy. And from the late 19th century, this sense of a crisis grows very important. I mean, it takes more and more importance in the minds of philosophers, and particularly, I would say, these two philosophers who were born in the same year, that is Husserl and Bergson. Both of them experienced. Husserl talks about it in terms of the crisis of sciences, and Bergson. And what is the real crisis over here? The real crisis is, can we know reality as it is? See, is it at all possible to know reality as it is? This is Bergson's starting point. And what he's saying is that whatever we know by homogeneous space and the differences of degree that is quantifiable, that is calculable, is one way of understanding which utilizes our intellect in an analytical fashion or a synthetic fashion. We analyze and synthesize using the intellect, but we are doing it from our experience of presence. On the other hand, which is what he's calling space. On the other hand, there is a way, whatever we are looking at is really not something static. It is a palimpsest of a continuous becoming. See, something is becoming all the time. And we ourselves are experiencing ourselves as we don't experience ourselves as changing in time. We are a continuous change that is just happening. So what Bergson is, his point of departure is that there is another way of knowing, which is the knowing of time. And the intuition of time, time is known not through analysis, time is known through intuition. Time is known through a certain way by which we can grasp the fact of becoming, the fact that things are a continuous becoming. So that becomes the starting point and the point of departure of Bergsonian philosophy, where he's putting us into contact with knowledge as the intuition intrinsic to time experience. Now, time experience itself is of a variety of kinds. So just like he's talking about space as homogeneous and characterized by differences of degree, he's characterizing time as heterogeneous and made up of differences in kind. Now, what that means is basically that we are experiencing something that's changing all the time. See, that can bring into manifestation latencies or powers of itself that are not visible at this moment. They're there in it, but there is a whole that is manifesting, as it were, its varieties and its potentia that are not known at all from the point of view in which we encounter them. So that kind of a knowledge is what he's talking about. Our first experience of that knowledge is through our own sense of time. Again, when we talk about becoming, when we talk about the fact that we are products of time, in the movement of time, we belong to the movement of time, then our access to it is through our memory. This is our personal access to it, through our memory. We deploy our memory in the present in such a way that we bring things, or largely unconsciously bring things that we know, both to reduce what we experience into the terms that we can understand, and to handle by instances that we know that which we are experiencing in the present. And this is what is bringing about the future. See? But what Bergson is saying is that, as a matter of fact, that is the operation of our analytical mind. But what is really happening is that the present is a constantly moving past that is moving into the future and is moving back into the past. See? So there is an expansion and a contraction of time that is going on. We are drawing on the past to move into the future, and the future is moving back into the past. So this is another way of saying that there is a continuous movement that we are experiencing in terms of these three times, that by nature or by dint of our mental existence, we see in terms of three vantages. See, so that there is a continuity, but there is also a constant. The present is already the past. Part of the present is already the past, and the past is already flowing into the future through the present. See, so there is a continuum, and we are at one point experiencing that continuum. At another point, we are analyzing that continuum into three times, instances that exist in the present, and the degrees by which they differ that allow us, as a matter of fact, to engage with them, to engage with the multiplicity. So multiplicity, the heterogeneity of time, is, Deleuze has a lovely sentence where he says, reality is characterized by multiplicity and simplicity, but multiplicity is not the multiple, and simplicity is not the one. And what he's meaning by that is that multiplicity is a latency. What we call the multiple is already what is distributed in space. But what is underneath it is a protean heterogeneity, a multiplicity that can infinitely manifest its differences. And on the other hand, we have something which is one alone. And so as soon as we use the word one, our minds think along with it of the other or of the many. In other words, it goes together with other opposites with which it can be paired. But if there is only one, that the characteristic of that is what Deleuze is calling simplicity. Simplicity is the overriding intuition of the only one that exists without comparison, so to say. So anyway, I mean, this is how Bergson approaches the intuition of time. Now, if everything is in a continuous flow, we may say that at this moment, right now, all time coexists. All the past coexists with us here and now. And more than that, because in a sense, it's not just the all, it's the whole. All that will unfold is also present right here and now. But what is our access to that? This is the question. And this analysis that I talked about, which he goes through in Time and Free Will, as Deleuze points out, it has some problems that he addresses in his next book, Matter and Memory. And according to Deleuze, one of the main things that happens there is the movement from time seen as a psychological experience, that we experience it in terms of memory that exists right now, to a ontological reality. In other words, this experience of time belongs to everything. It is time and its movement in which we are situated, but everything else, all the heterogeneity of the world, the multiple, is also part of that same ontological unfoldment of time as memory. So, of course, our access is different. When we are talking about the fact that we can experience or even think about, or to that extent, come into contact with time as a whole, we do not see that. We do that all the time. We hardly ever do that. We don't experience reality as that. We experience reality, as I said, as surfaces, in which this memory that we are talking about, if it is present at all, has become habitual. We also realize that this habitual memory is present all the way down. So even matter can be thought of as a habitual memory. And then all life forms can be thought of as degrees of habitual memory. See? And then we ourselves, most of our lives are spent without really accessing much of memory except for what we need at the moment. So it is again the habitual memory that we are contacting, and which gives us this sense of a thin surface of reality. Bergson uses a very beautiful phrase. He uses the phrase, the thickening of time. Time thickens if we really have access to the whole of the past, or even part of the past. There are moments when we seem to be larger than ourselves. We have a sense of who we were from our childhood. It's present right now. And as a result, our access to choices with which we can react to the present has increased, has expanded. That kind of an access to memory turns us more creative. So here, that's the whole notion of creative evolution. Creative evolution is creative when we find that we have access to large tracts of memory that give us much more choice. Now, on the other hand, as I said, there's habitual memory. All of reality, this is the ontological notion of memory. all of reality is progressing in a sense. And so this idea, if all of reality is progressing, but beings, entities have different degrees of access to memory, then how can we say that there is an evolution going on? See, and this notion of evolution is again, Bergson, by coming into relationship with the idea of evolution, is doing exactly what he wants to do with science: engage with it and introduce to it something that it does not have, which is the power of experience as knowledge itself, experience as knowledge. So here, if there is an interiority, a subjectivity to evolution, there has to be a certain kind of power that is propelling the evolution. If even when we are interacting with our present through habitual means, and that power is what he calls Elan vital. This is happening later in his book, Creative Evolution, so that there is a will, a motive force that is driving us. Now, Bergson does not believe in what is called evolutionism or finalism, which means that we have some image of where we are going. But he does believe in evolution as an unfolding. In other words, these creative choices that we are taking that allow novelty to be born in the present on a continuous basis is propelling us forward. And in a way, one may say that this forward propulsion is making more and more of this creative past to be available to us. The entirety of that, not only of past, but the entirety of time itself, we may say, is participating in the unfoldment of evolution. And that is the, one may say, automatic or forced movement of the evolution that is taking place, whether we are acting through habit or not. Even stones are participating in it. One of the examples that he gives repeatedly is that of a sugar cube that takes time to dissolve, that is participating in it. Animals are participating in it. We are participating in it, in this forced movement. But along with it, there is also a active participation in the sense that we can be conscious beings that have more or less access to this memory, this pure past, as he's talking about. See, so this, I would say, in a nutshell, is where he's getting at with regard to evolution. Now, and intuition, sorry. So now, intuition itself, as I said, we can have a direct intuition as individuals to this becoming in time, and we mobilize that intuition through our memory in creative acts. We could put it like that. But if time is ontological, if duration is ontological, then how do we contact that? And this is in creative evolution. Bergson is pointing to the fact that the human, again, this is not a human exceptionalism, but there is a place to the human where there is a kind of ability to experience inhuman durations. In other words, here again, similar to Sri Aurobindo, Bergson is saying that the stone, the plant, the animal live in us. All these durations are in us. We can experience these durations, and we should experience these durations. That is part of being human. And there are durations that we do not experience normally. As I said, our creativity, our access to the pure past. And again, Bergson will use the term integral here. The time itself is integral, or even the idea that we find manifesting through a philosopher is integral, and this integrality is what is being differentiated over time. So from that point of view, to be able to intuit these inhuman times, inhuman durations that exceed our normal scope is also an aspect of what we are called to do and be participants in a conscious and creative evolution. This is where Bergson is, in a way, moving in directions similar to Sri Aurobindo. Now, how do we have those? What kind of examples that does Bergson give us with regard to experiencing intuitions outside ourselves, the duration that is not my own, in a sense? And Bergson does. So he uses the term intellectual sympathy for this, that we can use intellectual sympathy for contacting durations outside ourselves. And I started with that example of the philosopher. You see, so the philosopher and the idea of the philosopher, which he gives us in Philosophical Intuition, is exactly an example of that at the level of the idea. Now, he's using a similar kind of analogy to talk about, the intuition of the life world. And by life world, I'm not using it in the Husserlian sense. I'm using it in the sense of the world of living things. So the world of living things has, here he comes to the, Elan Vital, for example, this creative urge in it. And we are also part of it. And so there's a way by which we can, by intellectual analysis, develop an understanding of the becoming, which is separate from what exists around us in the frame of space, and by sympathy come into contact with the power of that becoming, which is the Elan Vital. The whole of life is motivated by a will to creative becoming. We can come into contact with that, according to him, through this power of sympathy, and sometimes he's using the metaphor of music to talk about this. He's talking about rhythm. Every duration is its own rhythm. And so he's talking about, as it were, in a dance, to fall into a certain rhythm of becoming is to experience duration outside ourselves, in a way. A lot of this is something which one has to meditate on and really try to experience, and therefore it is intuitive thought itself. And that's why we cannot go too far in analyzing it, and I will leave it over there. He's also talking about matter, all of matter. So in other words, he's saying simultaneously we can see various things. There is an aeroplane that's flying, there's water in a river, a bird is flying, etc. And all these are different movements that we can encompass in ourselves to get the intuition of a single movement, the movement of matter itself, in a way. So these are the examples he's giving of intuition. And I will stop there as far as Bergson is concerned, because I realize that I'm quickly running out of time, which is what Bergson's philosophy is all about. But there is also objective and clock time. So here, let's move to Sri Aurobindo and look at intuition from the viewpoint of Sri Aurobindo. First and foremost, of course, Sri Aurobindo is inheriting, in a sense, the problems of philosophy, because both from the viewpoint of modernity, where we are the inheritors, whether we want it or not in a post-colonial sense, we are forced into the history of modernity, and also by dint of the fact of growing up and engaging with these problems in Cambridge, in England, and through his knowledge of French, etc., again, coming into contact with the mother, he's inheriting these problems, particularly this problem, the epistemological problem of the problem of knowing, of the thing in itself, one may say. But he's also encountering this problem from the viewpoint of Indian philosophy, again, just like Bergson, as a problem of becoming in himself. His first contact with this problem as a problem of becoming is as a revolutionary. And this is exactly what brings him into yoga. The first reason that he gets into yoga, asks his brother to connect him to a yogi, is because he is a revolutionary, and one of the things that he wants to have answered as a problem of becoming is the Gita's central question: what is the thing to be done? What should I do right now? Karyam karma, which he calls kartavyam, given an even extra, emphasis. Kartavyam karma. What is the obligatory work to be done right now? So is there a work to be done right now? Even the idea of that proposes the fact that there is a becoming that's going on in which we have a place. And there is an intuition by which we can come into contact with that which needs to be done. See? So that intuition cannot come due to our surface and analytical sense. Sri Aurobindo is looking for that. And he gets it from the very first encounter with the yoga teacher. How does he get it? He gets it from the complete silence of the mind, which is called in Indian traditions mano nasha, the destruction of the mind. And along with it, a unerring guidance from within, which he calls the adesh. So there is something which he doesn't even have to think about. Something else, another faculty projects what is the thing to be done. So that is his encounter, I'd say, with intuition to start with. But this problem, as an epistemological problem, continues because he wants, in a sense, to talk about the future evolution of the human. And as we find in his writings, over time, so we find some of these engagements taking place in his essays on the Gita, with the idea of jnana and vijnana. I will not go into depth, but we can discuss it. Then in his writings on the Upanishad, particularly the Kena Upanishad, also the Isha Upanishad, and then in his synthesis of yoga and the life divine, we find him in various places engaging with this idea of coming to direct knowledge, the epistemological problem. And in all these, there are some standard procedures, but there is something else, I'd say, which is how he analyzes it. So again, Sri Aurobindo also points to two sources of knowledge. Of course, Bergson is talking about one source, which is the intellectual source, and the other source, which is the intuitive source. But Sri Aurobindo is pointing to two intuitive sources of direct knowledge. Of course, he's also pointing to, in one of the chapters, The Life Divine, he's saying there is a knowledge by indirect contact, which is really the knowledge apparatus that is bringing sensory knowledge to us, which is the analytical knowledge that we talked about. There is knowledge by direct inner contact, which is what he's calling intuition. And there is the knowledge by identity, which is becoming one with whatever it is that one is trying to develop. So he's making a distinction between intuition and knowledge by identity. And for the intuition, he's talking about two sources. One is transcendent and one is immanent. In both cases, what one needs to do first is going within. So this notion of going within, again, is like Bergson, a taking away from the surface to contact something which is whole, which is a continuum, which is a flow, or which has an idea that is manifesting, or which is a being that is manifesting. So from those points, we find this idea of going within, though it is described in spatial terms. Going within is really a description that locates us as beings in space, but going into another space that is no longer the space that is locatable and becomes a space that is, again, not the differences are qualitative and in contact with the rest of creation. See, puts us into contact with reality as a play of intensive forces and processes of becoming. We enter into time. Now, Sri Aurobindo tells us also that we have an individual access to deep time, and that is the psychic being. The psychic being is the individual, you see, because Sri Aurobindo is also coming from a tradition that, experiences the reincarnation of the soul. In other words, the individual is a perpetual becoming, not only in time in these bodies that are changing, but even in bodies after bodies that we assume. So this continuity of movement, of the unfolding of the involuted individual is taking place. And that, in that sense, is the access to deep time in an individual sense, not merely as a mental contact with the ontological flow of time. So there is another way in which Sri Aurobindo is giving us an even more intimate contact with deep time. Now, as far as intuition goes, in his overall analysis, I would say he gives us 9 kinds of intuition. 5 in a scale of consciousness, as in Bergson's memory cone. So I'm going to come to that in a moment. And 4 in kinds of operational types. And these are the 9 kinds of intuition and 4 methods of intuition. Okay. Now, the scales, which I would say coincide with Bergson's memory cones. Bergson's memory cone is the way by which time and space become one. So that time is an expansion of all possibility, you may say. He uses the term virtuality. He doesn't like the word possibility, and for reasons that I will not go into right now, because that's an entire analysis in itself. But all of time, all the latencies or potentia of time in an expanded way available to us have contracted down to the present, where it's a screen of space of coexistence, that is of simultaneity and coexistence that is going on. So that is the memory cone, from there to the narrowed down present. And we may say that there are variations that have actually emerged in time. And you may say that the matter is the most condensed operation of time, and our intuition of matter would be that most condensed intuition of life. And as we've seen in Bergson himself, he's talking about the intuition of life, of the Elan vital as life, of ideas in mind. He's talking of social reality, and he's also talking about those realities or durations that go beyond us. In Sri Aurobindo's case, there is matter, life, mind, the psychic, which is its own sense of duration, and the spiritual. So these would be the 5. And then we also have the notion of the kinds of operation. And here Sri Aurobindo develops these kinds of operation of intuition Partly, I already spoke about what he talks about in the Life Divine with regard to contact by external, indirect external contact, direct internal contact, and knowledge by identity. But in his analysis of the Kena Upanishad, and this is a really important analysis, he is talking about 4 kinds of intuition. They are called Vijnana, Pragyana, Samgyana, and Ajnana. So Vijnana is comprehensive knowledge, knowledge of the one and the all at once. One would say this is like the pure time that Bergson is talking about, everything all at once, along with its differentials, the integral and its differentials. Then we have Pragyana, which is the objectified knowledge, the distributed knowledge of things. Then we have Samgyana, which is knowledge of things of each other. See, by sense contact, by contact by sense. And Ajnana, which is knowledge of things by will. There is a certain way in which we know what is the movement of evolution going on in each thing or in the whole. So each of these is being classified as a different form of knowledge or an operation of knowledge. Now, the interesting thing here to point out is that when Sri Aurobindo goes through this analysis, particularly when he's talking about these 4 kinds of knowledge in the Kena essays on the Kena Upanishad, he gives us a very striking example, which is the example of an insect. And he's talking about the fact that the subliminal consciousness in an insect knows exactly when it uses its stinger to sting its prey, how deep it has to go to numb it so that it can then proceed to attack it and kill it. So this kind of knowledge he's giving as an example of Samgyana. This very same example is given to us by Bergson. This is a key example, and it's almost certain that he's taking this example, he's getting this example from Bergson. Now, this text by Sri Aurobindo is quite an early text. It's really out of the Arya, but it's one of the early texts in Arya. And if Sri Aurobindo got this particular metaphor or instance or took it from Bergson at this time, then we have to say that he read Bergson quite early. Creative Evolution, as I said, came out in when? In 1908, 1907. And this was written, about 1917 or so. So I would say that he had already perhaps read Creative Evolution by that time. Now, the methods, there are 4 methods he gives us. And I know I've exceeded my time, but if Kundan is okay, I will just quickly go through. Thank you. So the 4 methods he gives us in the Synthesis of Yoga in a chapter called The Intuitive Mind. It's a very important chapter. It's in the 4th part. And the importance of this chapter comes from the fact that Sri Aurobindo, I'd say, like Bergson, is saying the future evolution of the human exists in first being able to establish an intuitive consciousness. You have to first, that's what is the intermediate consciousness necessary before we can actually supramentalize ourselves. And for that, he's talking about 4 methods. The first is the method he followed, which is the manonasha, the total destruction of the mind, and the opening to something that gives us direct knowledge. But he's also saying this is not necessary or not even easy for most people. And if we're going to talk about a yoga which is widespread, which is generic, which becomes the future evolution of the human, we have to find more gradual methods of replacing our surface understanding of things, our ignorance of things. So the second method he's pointing to is the opening up of the psychic being. This could start with the kind of sympathy that Bergson is talking about, a deep sympathy that puts us into contact with the rhythm of things, but also that in ourselves opens up this deep memory by which we know ourselves as the true person that each of us is, the person that has lasted through time. The third one, he says, is opening to the thousand-petaled lotus. In other words, the mind, even before it falls completely silent, can draw from a source of wisdom that it has faith in above itself. In other words, and the mother talks about this as well. She says, whatever you encounter, do not react immediately to it. Take a step back and put in a call to that which is above. Wait for its response, and its response will allow you to act. Bergson, in a very similar way, is talking about a similar method to access the memory cone. This taking a step back, this waiting, and allowing the larger potential of expanded knowledge to become part of our activities is, in a sense, the method of the memory cone in matter and memory. And the final method that Sri Aurobindo gives is to use thought itself to overcome thought. And here he's talking about, he doesn't elaborate it, but one could think of some examples. One is an example of what is traditionally called Jnana Yoga, where you use a discrimination of thought to apply it to reality itself until you see it in reality. This is meditation on an idea, so to say. The second is similar to the first, where you utilize what is called aporetic thought. The Greeks call it aporia, which is a kind of a paradox. In other words, in the Buddhist tradition, something like a koan. The Upanishads also have many of these paradoxes that the mind is completely at a standstill when it encounters them. If we hold on to them, pushes us beyond the boundaries of mental limitation to experiences that are intuitive and of ultimately of identity. And the third could be the kind of philosophical method that Bergson is talking about, a method that begins with an analysis of space and time, but pushes us to an experience of direct intuition through sympathy. So these, I would say, are the methods of intuition Sri Aurobindo gives us. And I would like to end with two quotations from Sri Aurobindo. One of them is coming to us from the Synthesis of Yoga, and the other is coming from the Life Divine. So here is the quotation from the Life Divine. So this is in the Complete Works, chapter 15, the Supreme Truth Consciousness. And here it's page 142. And here Sri Aurobindo is talking about conscious force and conscious being. And here this is what he's saying over here. The development, it's following from the previous paragraph. So he says, this development, we could say the development and progress of the world according to an original truth of its own being implies a succession of time, a relation in space, and a regulated interaction of related things in space, to which the succession of time gives the aspect of causality. Time and space, according to the metaphysician, have only a conceptual and not a real existence. But since all things are not only and not only these are forms assumed by conscious being in its own consciousness, the distinction is of no great importance. Time and space are that one conscious being viewing itself in extension, subjectively as time, objectively as space. Our mental view of these two categories is determined by the idea of measure, which is inherent in the action of the analytical dividing movement of mind. Time is for the mind a mobile extension, measured out by succession of the past, present, and future, in which mind places itself at a certain standpoint, whence it looks before and after. Space is a stable extension measured out by divisibility of substance. At a certain point in that divisible extension, mind places itself and regards the disposition of substance around it. In actual fact, mind measures time by event and space by matter. But it is possible in pure mentality to disregard the movement of event and the disposition of substance and realize the pure movement of conscious force, which constitutes space and time. These two are then merely two aspects of the universal force of consciousness, which in their intertwined interaction comprehend the warp and woof of its action upon itself. So this is very interesting, and it also relates to the question one may ask about whether Bergson considers time and space to be two separate realities and hence a duality, or whether there is a monism. And of course, he makes it very clear that it is a monism. He's splitting the two apart for the sake of analysis, just like Sankhya does with Purusha and Prakriti. But as a matter of fact, there is a monism. For him, it's a monism of becoming. But for Sri Aurobindo, it's a monism of the absolute that is experiencing itself in these two ways. But as Deleuze points out with regard to Bergson, in his thought too, it moves in that direction. I just read a short where Deleuze ends his chapter relating to matter and memory by saying, if things endure, or if there is a duration in things, this is the multiplicity of durations, the question of space will need to be reassessed on new foundations. For space will no longer simply be a form of exteriority, a sort of screen that denatures duration, an impurity that comes to disturb the pure, a relative that is opposed to the absolute. Space itself will need to be based in things, in relation between things and between durations, to belong itself to the absolute, to have its own purity. This was to be the double progression of the Bergsonian philosophy. In other words, Bergson moves towards this notion of time and space as both belonging to the absolute. And as a last quotation, I read from Sri Aurobindo's chapter on Towards a Supramental Time Vision, the last chapter of the Synthesis of Yoga. And here's the quote. If we could be aware of all the present, all the action of physical, vital, mental energies at work in the moment, it is conceivable that we would be able to see their past too, involved in them, and their latent future, or at least to proceed from present to past and future knowledge. And under certain conditions, this might create a sense of real and ever-present time continuity, a living in the behind and the front, as well as the immediate. And a step further might carry us into an ever-present sense of our existence in infinite time, and in our timeless self, and its manifestation in eternal time, might then become real to us. And also, we might feel the timeless self behind the worlds and the reality of his eternal world manifestation. In any case, the possibility of another kind of time consciousness than we have at present, and of a triple time knowledge, rests upon the possibility of developing another consciousness than that proper to the physical mind and sense, and breaking our imprisonment in the moment and in the mind of ignorance with its limitation to sensation, memory, inference, and conjecture. A quotation that, in a sense, resonates very beautifully with Bergson. And with that, I end. Thank you.
I'm on double because my connection's not good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Debashish. This was incredible and just so clear. And I mean, that's not surprising, but it was delightful to experience it. And you brought up so many points that I could talk about, and so I'm going to have to minimize the things I bring up. But one quick question, and then sort of one bigger question, and then a smaller question. So I just missed the metaphor that you said was the one that you found in Sri Aurobindo and in Bergson. Can you just repeat which one that was?
It's the metaphor of the insect that knows how to numb its prey. I can send you the actual reference from Bergson. If I'm sure you've come.
I know the passage. And
I can send you the passage from Sri Aurobindo.
I would love that. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So this, well, first of all, the small question, and this is something I think we've talked about a number of times already, but there's a big debate kind of going on among Bergson people right now about the difference, or his opposition, stark opposition that he makes at times, especially in creative evolution, between intelligence and intuition. And I'm personally, and a couple of other people at this conference that I'm at right now in San Diego, North American Society for Early Phenomenology, we've been talking about Bergson the whole weekend, and there's this question of why did he make such a stark opposition? And so many people are drawing out exactly how intelligence is always implied within intuition. And so there's this sort of false dichotomy there. So I don't know, you could maybe speak to that a little bit. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about is what I took to be how you were differentiating Sri Aurobindo and Bergson, which was on the different types of intuition, I believe. And so maybe you could say more about that. But I really think, and again, this is coming up a lot at the conference, it's something I've thought about a lot recently, about all the times Bergson describes intuition and what it is, and how they really don't map onto each other. They're very different at different times, and they do very different things. And so, I mean, I think, first of all, intuition for Bergson is a qualitative multiplicity. So there are not only multiple, but an infinite number of types of intuition. That doesn't mean everything is intuition, of course, but you brought up some really interesting ones that I think a lot of people don't always talk about, which is from the philosophical intuition essay. He talks about the intuition you can gain of a philosopher. And, Berkeley, for instance, is an idealist and is a kind of static thinker in some ways. He's also against calculus entirely, right? And but yet he's one of Bergson's favorite philosophers. And he shows us how we can gain an intuition of a thinker like that. It's so fascinating. And so that's one of the kinds, and it's completely, antithetical to other types of intuition that he talks about. So interesting for that. And he also talks about intuition as the mind grasping the mind, right? Like the mind's grasp of the mind. But then other times he'll say, let go of yourself and just fall into becoming, basically. And that's what we do with the sugar cube, and times when we just coincide with the becoming of matter, right? So that's another, completely different type of intuition. So I think it's amazing that you're outlining these 9 types of intuition in Sri Aurobindo. And I think that maybe we could kind of, match some of them up, and maybe some wouldn't match up But I also think, there's probably an infinite number of types of intuition for Bergson, and the idea that intuition is necessarily connected with intelligence on the one hand, but on the other hand, invention, means that we're necessarily, as Bergsonians of the future, going to be inventing new types of intuition that likely Bergson and Sri Aurobindo had never conceived of. So anyway, I know I covered a lot.
Yeah, thank you. All those are very, very, I think, stimulating thoughts, Jack. I think, so firstly, I think about the difference between intellect and intuition. Sri Aurobindo also makes not that trenchant a divide, but the divide. And I think for him, it's exactly, I think the reason it becomes so trenchant in Bergson is exactly he's fighting the Kantian tradition, that you can only go so far with analysis and synthesis of the intellect, but there has to be something else which gives you direct access. And so for Sri Aurobindo, I mean, that again becomes more nuanced. And this also, I think it relates to this notion of the infinite and the multiple. And yes, I think, that's the thing about multiplicity is not the multiple. Ultimately, you can derive, or you can differentiate infinite instances or types out of these things. But for now, I think he's talking about a certain spectrum connecting, the external and the internal, or knowledge by external, what he calls knowledge by external, indirect knowledge by external contact, and direct knowledge by internal contact. So there is a spectrum, and that's how he's trying to draw it. But I think he also says there are differences in kind between the two. And intellectual understanding of something by rational process and an intuitive understanding of the same, could complement. And I think Bergson does that, where he's talking about Berkeley. He's doing that. And that's where he says that you actually need to engage with these people on the surface a lot and familiarize yourself before you can really catch it. Where he's talking about Spinoza, he's saying, oh, there's all this heavy stuff going on with all his scholiums and theorems and geometry and all that. But along with it, there's something really light underneath it all. He uses that term, very light. And that's the idea that's there in all this. And you can get bogged down by the first, but if you persist, and you can start distilling the second, And I think I'd say it seems as if, just like with the space and time, that they're almost a duality. But I'd say there are places in Bergson where they're not so much of a duality also, that they work together, so to say. And yeah, I agree with you about, and also the thing about the different kinds of intuition that Bergson gives us. I think, again, when we are talking about philosophy as method, I think that's where actually enumerating them and talking about the 9 or the 8 is useful. But I mean, it's not exhaustive. And I think it's also practical. I think these enumerations are practical. And as you said, they're practical relative to the now, to the present, depending on the community of ideas. But the future may make other analysis more necessary and practical as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Mira's hand up. So Mira, please unmute yourself. And
yeah, hi, Debashish ji. That was wonderful, a lot to grasp. My question was, I think you mentioned there were 4 ways of acquiring knowledge, according to the Upanishad, or I don't know what the source was. And one you said was Vigyan, and then you said Pragyan, did you say? And there was 2 other. Could you just say that, explain that again?
Yeah. So the 4 that Sri Aurobindo is elaborating from the Upanishads, interestingly, in the Upanishads themselves, they just name these 4. But Sri Aurobindo actually goes into descriptions of these four. And they are Vijnana, which is for him comprehensive knowledge. And that term is used in several other contexts. And ultimately, it becomes equivalent to supermind itself, which is simultaneous knowledge of the one and the many. So in the Gita, which is also one of the sources he's getting this notion of Vijnana from, they talk about Jnana and Vijnana. There are two kinds of knowledge, Jnana and Vijnana. Jnana is self-evident knowledge by identity. It's the kind of knowledge by which you know that you exist. You cannot describe how you know that you exist. You just know that you exist. So that is Jnana. Knowledge of anything and everything of that kind, that essential self-evident knowledge, is Jnana. And Sri Aurobindo will call it knowledge by identity. But also there is Vijnana, which means knowledge of your properties. Who are you and what are you, right? If you try to now give your name, your background, your family history, your education, your profession to anybody who asks you who you are, like Jack was saying, differentiating the infinity of who you are for practical purposes right now. So the two together, you are yourself and you are also unfolding yourself as your properties. The two together is that form of knowledge is called Vijnana. Then Pragyana is where you've abstracted your sense of essence and are only projecting yourself as your differentia. It's like Berkeley's books. Okay, so we come across his ideas in his books, but we have to reconstitute the essence out of those ideas. So that second projected, objectified knowledge is Pragyana. And Samgyana is the sense knowledge by contact. So we don't know each other except through sense contact, so to say. And that is our samgyana, knowledge by sense contact. And agyana is knowledge by will. In other words, I can know certain things only in doing it. See, I don't know what it's like until I start doing it. I unite myself with the will to become of something, and that then becomes what it is trying to become. So that kind of knowledge is agyana. And actually, as Jack was saying, in various ways, Bergson is touching all these in his various examples of intuition.
Thank you.
Michael Hebel.
Debashish, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm asking a question to see if I'm understanding the contrast and complementarianism between Bergson and Sri Aurobindo. With these ideas of unfolding and novelty and being propelled forward, as I listen to your discourse, I was forming the idea that for Sri Aurobindo, this is a continuity on a personal level of moving from body to body to body, sort of the idea of reincarnation, but that for Bergson, the idea of the Elan vital and the unfolding and the novelty and the being propelled forward is something that occurs on the human species level and not propelled into the future, let's just say on an individual level.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, Mike. And I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't have so much time to develop the so-called divergences. And yeah, so essentially because Bergson is coming out of a tradition that does not, assume reincarnation and does not have a kind of a experience of that particular reality in a common general sense. For him, this ontological evolution is taking place in mass. It's taking not only in the human, but in everything. It's taking place through this Elan vital, which is like a universal force, an automatic force of evolution. And it becomes conscious in the human in the sense that in our lives, we can actually, in the scope of our short lives, open ourselves to, by this faculty of contact with the whole, open ourselves to further evolution consciously. But in Sri Aurobindo's case, evolution is being furthered also at the individual level through reincarnation. So there's an individualization of evolution that's going on. And, it's persisting from life to life, so that there is, that's just like an idea, you may say, actually, so this is the other point, that when we are talking, let's say, about Bergson's or Berkeley's central idea that is manifesting as these four forms, these ideas themselves are not isolated ideas. It's multiplicity, but again, that multiplicity of ideas includes all the other ideas as well. They're only forefronting a certain complex of ideas. Similarly, human souls, according to Sri Aurobindo, would be like that. Each of our souls has all the potential of all souls within it, but it's a kind of configuration for the sake of manifestation of some of them. So that's the individualization of the evolution that's going on in all the beings that are experiencing time itself from life to life, not just in one life. So you're right, that is exactly one of the differences that is implicit in this comparison.
So you can say, Debashish, as if I may just add, that Sri Aurobindo is talking about phylogenetic as well as ontogenetic evolution simultaneously.
And phylogenetic evolution, which is individually carried. So, there could be phylogenetic evolution in ontogenetic evolution, as they say, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny in a general sense.
Right.
But it's actually being experienced by each of us individually due to the persistence of the individual.
Yeah. Thank you. Ika.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. And I have actually 3 questions, so I will just tell them quickly. It's you can choose whether to cover it or not. One is that according to Bergson, what is more fundamental, time or movement? And the second question is that has he discussed or brought in the concept of light in his treatment for space and time? And the third is the predictability, meaning in our ajnana or surface consciousness, according to science. There was until the advent of quantum mechanics, there was such a notion that if we can actually assess or understand past and present properly, we can actually foresee the future. In other words, we can totally build the future because there is nothing other than that. So there is no such thing as actually new. But of course it has been challenged by quantum theory, which says that our perception of reality also contributes to this whole thing. So you cannot really predict. So if Bergson has something to say about it. So these 3. Thank you.
Yeah. So as far as the first question is concerned, which has to do with what is more primary, time or movement, I would say that, I mean, that as it's a little fuzzy as far as, becoming is primary. I think I would say becoming is primary. And by becoming, we could say movement in time or movement of time. That is that there is a force or will in time to expand potential of its own heterogeneity. So that is one. About light, I don't know. I will defer to Jack for that. Maybe he has something to say, because if that may have something to do with his debate and with Einstein and what he puts forth in duration and simultaneity, which is his work that continues that debate in a sense. But to the third question, absolutely, that is one of the ways in which he differs very substantially from classical physics. Novelty is being born at all times because again, the same thing, we can know the whole by essence. We can never know it by its unfoldment. New things can come from it at any time because the whole is infinite, radically infinite. And out of it come potential, which are changes or differences in kind that are taking place all the time. So it is definitely not predictable in that sense. Jack, would you care to say anything about light?
Yeah, he uses Newton's light experiment, and there he's drawing on Ravison and Aristotle, and understands the multiplicity of shades of light as constitutive and constructive of pure light. So he has a really important sort of metaphor there for understanding duration. In terms of Einsteinian and like more contemporary ideas of light, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but he's using it more in the classical metaphor of intuition and light that comes from Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus, but he's sort of inverting it in the way that he does. So I don't know, Keiko, we can talk about this more another time, but yeah.
On this topic, I was also reminded of an observation that you made, Debashish, that after 1920s, after the debate that he had with Einstein, he basically, sort of went into obsolescence. And I was thinking that maybe, the growth of positivism had to do a lot of that, a lot to do with this, because post 1920s, we saw this massive proliferation of the positivist ideas. And I think science, for the next 30 years or so was dictated exclusively by the positivist philosophy, the positivist and the logical positivist philosophy, because of which, also Bergson, sort of went into oblivion. What is interesting to me, though, is that how did, positivism come back into the fray when the fundamentals of positivism had already been challenged by Einstein? So it almost feels as if, there was this backlash of the Newtonian paradigm, if you will, against the contentions that had been made by Einstein and other quantum the physicists, So that's another interesting thought, that came to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
You're absolutely right, Kundan. And it just does point to the fact of, I mean, partly this may be considered the heterogeneity of time, that in a way, I mean, many times coexist. I mean, certain things have gone ahead and, disproved certain ideas of the past, but other times that act as if they don't even know what has happened, coexist with it, and sometimes gain even prominence over that which has addressed them already. So that you're absolutely right. I mean, there are these, and we can see it all the time. We can see it right now. I mean, there are, you know, returns in a way that reopen the finished products of history, you may say. History is never, as it were, finished. And even when it's finished, you find people who act like it's never finished.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Dana.
Thank you. Debashish, my question is around accessing and opening, and this idea of stepping back and putting in a call and then allowing for the answer. And I guess what's sort of frustrating to me is that we can share these ideas, discuss them, yet accessing and opening seems like something that is a becoming, that's something that is a happening, that it's not a doing. And I was wondering if you could speak to that we're thinking and sharing ideas about something that is that is an accessibility that happens to us in a way, as opposed to something we create or do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, Dana. But you see, the thing is that either we can leave it to a domain of pure happenstance. In other words, it happens to some people, go ahead and try it out and it'll happen to you, etc. Or there can be a method towards it. Method can never fully predict. This goes back to the notion of prediction. What is going to happen? You see, and it can never predict fully that it will happen. But method takes you as close as possible to its happening. So that's where, talking about the fact that, and you see, in a way, when Bergson is saying that there is a evolutionary force, which is, automatic, ontologically present, right, which creates a forced movement in reality, even outside of living reality and human reality, and that we as beings have a certain amount of receptivity or capacity for, he says, turning our, attention or our consciousness to various realms of this memory cone. We're talking about a method. And again, when Sri Aurobindo is talking about, sort of make yourself as quiet as possible, or the mother is saying, take a step back and call, and something is going to come. They're talking about a method, which in some sense has the same kind of parameters that operate in both cases. You see, something is already there. There is a force, and you're opening yourself to that force. And there's a way by which you can do that. You see, like Sri Aurobindo will also talk about creativity in these terms. Like he himself was a poet. He would say that one method by which you can increase your access to the poetic inspiration is to select a time and select an amount of time at that time and just make yourself available. It's just like the people who meditate. At first, they can't meditate, but they're told, select a time, sit down for 15 minutes, whether you can meditate or not, and try. So that builds a receptivity in the physical mind that, in a sense, is the operation of a faith. And by faith, I use the term of faith will, as Jonathan has translated the word Shraddha, which is the Indian term. It's not a belief. It's more like a kind of inner intuition. It's itself an intuition, a contact with that itself, but that grows due to giving it a method.
Thank you. Art?
Thank you. Hey, Dr. B. As usual, thank you so much of your talk. Just, lit up different questions and what have you. But one in particular, I'm going to see if I can drill down on. I didn't exactly catch the name. It sounded like Haridas karma, but it was, what is the obligatory work to be done right now?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's a kind of individual level and a kind of collective level. And I know
Yes.
my own self individually, I've got a lot of obligatory work to be done, but I'm wondering if either Bergson or Sri Aurobindo kind of pointed at a collective level of obligatory work that we should. I know, it's not going to be something as simple as I would like, we should all go out and vote or whatever the case may be, but just in general.
Yeah. We should all go out and vote, by the way. But I think that's a very good question, Art. And I think there are things to be done now that are general, and there are things to be done that are specific for each individual. And I think the question exactly is being posed like that by Arjuna in the Gita. The term used in the Gita is karyam karma, Karyam, karma, Karma, and the more obligatory emphasis is kartavyam karma, Kartavyam, kartavyam karma. So the thing to be done right now, again, we can think about this memory cone, and we can think about time and history as itself an unfoldment that has put us into contact with the present. And there are ways by which evolution can be furthered right now. And we cannot be told what that is in, like from a book or by somebody from the outside. But again, here is where it comes in that what you need to do right now is tied to that. And by access to that, you feel the imperative of what is to be done right now. In Sri Aurobindo's case, it was his nationalist activity at that time that he felt it had to be done. It was almost a mandate of the time that, we have to throw out the colonizer. Okay. And I have a part to play in that. And so just like in Krishna, there's a war to be fought. And he could say, well, somebody will fight this war. And he does say that, actually, by the way. He tries that with Krishna. He says, oh, why should I fight? You're just telling me right now this battle has already been fought. Why are you asking me to fight this battle? And he says to him that you are part of that process by which it is being fought. You are a participant in that process. So you have to know what your part is. That is the karyam karma. And first, as you said, we don't even know what are the imperatives of our time. It's just like what Kundan was saying about suddenly something comes to us and says that, that there's something wrong. The epistemological basis of our times is collapsing. You see, that's in a way an intuition that is related to our time. So in the same way, we can come into contact with our, imperatives and find what is important for me within that through this kind of intuition, I'd say.
Thank you. Sonki.
Dr. Banerji, I think my question is about the topic I'm the becoming, and I've been always wondering about the faith, the Shraddha in Sanskrit, and to Dana's question, you made your answer saying that you relate faith to intuition, intuition. So in my understanding, faith is like, in my reading of Sri Aurobindo, the sense of a faith is more like a realm of will, human willing. And this is kind of active mental power of a human being. But Sri Aurobindo also mentions faith is originally, its origin is kind of from the soul, So it's a kind of a soul power as well. So maybe the contents of becoming is there, maybe. So the power and intuition. So for me, I mean, the faith and intuition, for me, faith is more like active power, but the source is soul. So I think it's a very subtle problem for me regarding the becoming. So soul's becoming, but also our prakriti kind of active power also related to that. So it's very subtle for me. So if you give more comments on it, I'd very appreciate it.
Yeah, so actually Sri Aurobindo has a quote about on various things he said about Shraddha. So because faith, he's regularly translated Shraddha as faith, but many people misunderstand faith as a kind of a belief in a belief system, for example. But of course, as you very well pointed out, it's a soul power, as he says, it's a soul power. And one of his quotes about it is, faith as an intuition looking for experience to validate it. That's one of his definitions of faith. Faith is an intuition looking for experience to validate it. In other words, it already has that intuitive contact, but knows that so-called receptivity to something, to the wider, call it the pure time or the whole or the integral, the thousand petal lotus or divine, the master of the yoga, whatever it is, it's essentially, it's already, there is a transpersonal contact with that. And out of that contact comes this notion of what is the thing to be done. And being a soul power, as you said, it is related to becoming. That's why Shraddha is in the Gita very closely connected to Swabhava and Swadharma. You are what yo yat Shraddha sa eva sa. You are what your faith is. And that's basically the unfoldment of your swabhava, your self-being. The idea that you are is unfolding, and that unfoldment is taking place through, the mother has a beautiful translation for faith. I think that is really more appropriate. She calls it a clairvoyant will. A clairvoyant will. A will that already knows and is in contact with its own fulfillment and is calling it into life, into action.
I also think that maybe, for clearing this distinction between Shraddha and faith, it would be interesting to go into etymology of Shraddha. I haven't done that, I'm going to do it. Do you have any idea, Debashish, have you looked into the etymology?
No, I have not actually looked into the etymology. It's a good suggestion. I would love to look at that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. That's a great definition. I really like the definition you gave me. Intuition looking for experience to validate it. I think that's a wonderful definition. Thank you.
Robert, please come in.
You're muted,
You have
Robert.
to mute yourself.
There I am. Thank you. So Debashish, this was a wonderful presentation, and you've generated so many important points and conversations. Thank you. I wanted to add one, and that is the similarity between Sri Aurobindo's idea of the future evolution, which he says requires certain spiritually advanced individuals who then need to find their community And that relationship is what will advance humanity. And in Bergson's two sources of morality and religion, he similarly says that the élan vital will proceed by certain mystics or prophets who pour hot into the religions or into the societies, and that then cools, and it's possible for ordinary people to have access to the rich sort of mine that the prophets and the mystics pour, and they both see this wonderful process going on of the pouring and the absorption, and then that becomes the platform for the next mystic and the next prophet. I think is quite a similar. In this case, it would not be Sri Aurobindo taking from Bergson, but the other way around.
Oh yeah, I think Robert is, yeah, it's a very important point, and actually this point, I mean, the social in Bergson, the social assumes an ontological importance. Just like, you know, the vital or the material, each one of these is its own evolution, one may say. The social is just like the individual or the mental. The social becomes an entity of evolution. This is also present in Sri Aurobindo, but it's not that developed. It gets more developed by the mother and her work, and the notion of collective yoga, for example. But also in Bergson, the idea of the social as an evolving entity becomes more developed after him, I think. And, you know, you have today, you know, the more present contemporary followers of Bergson. That's why I started by saying he's becoming more and more important now, where he had fallen into neglect in the middle. So you have people like Gilbert Simondon, who also is drawing heavily from Bergson. And for him, what you're talking about, the individual who then becomes an entity that is part of a community that is evolving in itself, is an aspect of individuation that he calls trans-individuation. Trans-individuation is not the individual going, I mean, that's happening too. The individual is going beyond himself. But trans-individuation is the individuation of the socius. The social reality is it's becoming an individual as well. So that has its own reality. And I think we can read that into Bergson in his two sources of morality and religion. Thank you.
I'm also reminded of the fact that you know, Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri has also written on Bergson. You know, so given that you're doing this work, you know, maybe it would be important.
Thank you.
To visit his work as well. You know,
absolutely.
As you comment on my thread.
Yeah, I have not read him actually on Bergson, but I would like to. Yeah, he's such a fantastic thinker. Yeah. It's important to include him. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think, you know, we had a wonderful morning / afternoon. You know, this is great. Thank you so much, Debashish, for this wonderful presentation. And as Robert pointed out, you know, it generated so much animation in us in a nice way. You know, we had our thoughts, we had our points, you know, we discussed things with you, we offered, you know, counterpoints and so on and so forth. It's great, you know, this is wonderful for the community.
Thank you.
I'm extremely thankful for this wonderful presentation. You know, we'll look forward to having you back, you know, on something, you know, on which you're working lately. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Debashish.
And next week, I'm making a presentation on the connections between Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri and the mother.
Oh, wonderful.
We know of Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri as this incredible philosopher that he was, but he had a wonderful relationship with the mother, which comes out from the letters that he wrote to the mother over a period of time. And that shows, his bhakta side and his devotion to the mother. And I think in the talk, it will also come out that while he was here, he was actually doing the mother's work. And the fellowship, was established for the mother's work. That also becomes very, very evident from the exchanges that they both had. So I'm going to talk about that, and as I said, an aspect of Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri which doesn't get spoken about. So I look forward to having you if you have time. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Debashish. Thank you, Kundan.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.